This is a production of Cornell University.
Welcome to Mann Library's Chats in the Stacks Book Talk series. In today's talk, originally recorded on March 3, 2011, Rachel Louise Moran, recipient of the 2010 College of Human Ecology Fellowship in the History of Home Economics, examines the spread of height and weight tables in schools, agricultural extension programs, and home economics curriculum. The talk considers the relationship between female lay citizens and experts, the political power of statistics, and the use of contemporary physical measurements, especially the body mass index.
So first I want to thank everyone on the committee, Sharon and Jeff Sobel especially, and also all of the library staff and archivists who helped me so much, even getting me special permission to watch a film today, especially Eileen Keating and Elaine Engst. Also, this is a little bit unorthodox, but I want to thank my parents who came up from Rochester because they're so supportive and that's really, really sweet. So, while we don't always admit it, historians, including myself, are incredibly presentist, meaning we are so often driven by contemporary issues. In the case of my in-progress dissertation, which Sharon named, and what I'm presenting today, which is one of its chapters, I'll admit my motivation is very much based in contemporary issues and very much based in trying to understand how the federal government, in particular, became so interested in citizen height, weight, physique, and in this issue right now of obesity. How did it develop this interest, and why did it develop the way it did, and what does it mean to seriously consider body shaping and maintenance as a political project, not just a social and cultural issue we're used to thinking about it as? What changes when we think about it as being about citizenship, about being about politics? And these are the questions driving this and driving me crazy. So the dissertation in general tries to historicize these body issues beginning in the late 19th century and going through everything from the calorie experiments of Wilbur Atwater up to home economics advice giving, like today, as well as World War II draftee rejections, the President's Physical Fitness Council, and finally, in the 60s, a more intense medicalization of weight, height, and obesity. And I think all of this situating I just tried to do will help contextualize a little bit about what I'm talking about today. So, ultimately, okay, sorry. I'm talking about height, weight today, but I will be talking about home economists and what they do in a larger context of the Public Health Service, of the Children's Bureau, and the AMA, the American Medical Association, what their professional peers are doing at the same time and how they actually differ quite a bit from them. So as I explore these body politics with an emphasis on the spread of height-weight standards and charts, I'll first discuss the expert development of these standards, as well as their quick spread and their incredible popularity among lay citizens. Then I'm going to explore the controversy that developed over these charts in the early 20s. Many of the same experts who developed and promoted weight charts grew wary of their flaws and overuse really, really quickly after they developed and spread them. They were trying to then reshape the conversation and minimize the role that height-weight charts were supposed to play. But what happened is that these charts had spread so quickly and they offered such authority and clarity through their numerical standards that really, once professionals and especially once laywomen had come to terms, had accepted that these quantifiable standards were going to show them health, they wouldn't let go. Ultimately, I argue that most experts settled for some semantic changes, a few changes in numbers, having really lost control of their own creations. And as we'll see, home economists throughout position themselves uniquely compared to all of their professional peers. A surprising difference worthy of some exploration and analysis. In a sense, I'd say the home economists came late to the party, and then they kind of brought the party. as much as any home economist can. And so since we're talking about home economists and the history of home economics, I also still have a lot to think about, and I can't imagine a better audience to do that with. So I really appreciate your input in the Q&A or after. All right. Amid the progressive era, that historical period roughly from 1890 to World War I, social science was the name of the game. Professional women, social reformers, and government agents believed the best way to fix the population was to know it intimately. And the best way to know it intimately was to measure it through surveys, charts, and statistical analysis. And for numerous reformers and professionals interested in improving health, especially but not exclusively child health, careful measurement and standards were just key. Even as women were taught starting in the 1910s that they needed to carefully monitor their children, husbands, and occasionally, though surprisingly rarely, themselves, they were often met with criticism for their inadequate measurement technique. So in this 1919 Children's Bureau film, essentially these two women, they are sitting on their porch and they see in the newspaper an article that tells them how incredibly important it is to go and measure their children. And of course, they respect what the government has to say. So an ice truck drives by and they put their baby on the scale in the ice truck. And the baby's not happy. It's not a very accurate measurement. And then there's a series of ridiculous things they do. They try and put the baby on a grocery scale, but it keeps falling off. And then finally, professionals intervene. And with the help of a local women's club, which had been supported by a National Child's Bureau agent, we see the scientific approach, the happy baby, dangling toys. Essentially, they're pleasing the infants and mothers and also introducing the mothers to incredibly rigid, detailed height weight standards. Through infant measurement and well baby clinics, reformers brought women in for the increasingly popular weighing and measuring of children, after which they could introduce mothers to scientific standards of health as well as hygiene. There's a clinic. In these early days, with specific measurement and scales just beginning to spread out of the realm of medical research and sometimes Coney Island-style carnival fun of weighing yourself, the project of assessing health by the numbers was no casual matter. It's not like getting your BMI today. It required a lot of complicated measurement. So in one a little extreme, but not as extreme as you would think, example, the American Baby Health Association put out a set of rules to go along with its baby scorecards. And the rules include facts like the general examination room should be large, well ventilated, and well warmed. The Committee on Equipment should provide a quantity of flannel torn into squares. The room should be provided with 3 tables and a number of chairs. Upon the first table is a measuring board. Special specifications for construction may be obtained by the State House in Des Moines, Iowa. 1 tape measure and reel, 1 pair of physician's calipers. The second table needs calipers for cranial measurements, scales, tape measures, an optician's ivory rule, and individual wooden tongue depressors. And the third table requires, among other things, a measuring board upon which the child may be laid. The board, 4 feet long, should have a stationary headpiece and footpiece sliding in a groove beside the scale on the board. And in addition to all this, I'm leaving a lot out, including down to the fact that women were to record their information with decimals, not fractions. So clearly, these intensive regimens of measurement were more than even the most dedicated mothers or professionals could handle efficiently. And given that progressive ideology typically emphasized not only quantitative knowing, but also efficiency, a compromise strategy began to emerge. Height weight charts promised to diagnose health problems or allow for the rewarding of health, like if you do well on a contest, without the borderline neurotic techniques of some of this earlier measurement. So what exactly are these tables that come to wed progressive ideals of efficiency with progressive ideals of objective quantitative experts. The first height-weight charts were developed for men by a Belgian mathematician in the 1830s and were modified throughout the century. While charts spread through the insurance profession in the period, they were not embraced by either reform groups or the medical profession. Physicians rarely weighed patients, even children, relying instead on subjective assessments of child health, markers like physique, skin tone, and posture. Only in the late 19th century, as progressive ideals start to permeate the medical profession, do physicians even begin to take and record the measurements, the weight of their patients. Even then, weight is often a line that was left blank on doctors' forms at the time. Instead, the early aims of these charts was to help life insurance companies, to help them set rates, an aim that would follow these charts up through the mid-20th century. Each company had its own charts with inconsistent numbers based on their data, and the numbers also had flaws based in the fact that data about people came only from people well enough off to apply for life insurance, and that's not the most diverse population in the mid-19th century. And it also was data supplied by family physicians. You wouldn't have a scale in your home or anything. So it'd be data supplied by a family physician, and there were accusations quite a bit that the family physician would lie to help somebody get life insurance, which usually meant saying the person weighed more than they did so that they wouldn't be suspected of having tuberculosis, in which case they could not be insured. So keep in mind, it's critical to keep in mind with these standards, as a final bit about like the Life Extension Institute, which is a collection of a few insurance companies, I should say, that these standards were developed not with the idea of promoting health, like we tend to think about, but actually with the ideal of predicting death. Height-weight tables only began to gain legitimacy outside of life insurance communities through the 1916 development of tables by Lewis Dublin. While he was a MetLife employee and was involved in the same insurance aims as other people, he was also a respected statistician, and his standard table of heights and weights drew on much more data than any previous tables. Dublin's tables were soon adopted by the AMA for use as health, not death indicators. And the Public Health Service developed its own charts based on this data to evaluate civil service applicants. And then all branches of the armed services also adopt versions of the Public Health Service charts for their own purposes. Meanwhile, other experts are going to zone in on children's heights and weights as indicators of general health. Most famous are the Baldwin-Wood and the Woodbury tables. The Baldwin-Wood are for children 6 and up, and the Woodbury tables were for 6 and under. And these are going to be embraced by many government and professional organizations. These are the ones that the Children's Bureau and the Bureau of Home Economics are going to care about. Charts caught on with these governmental and professional groups for a reason. Charts offered immediate scientific authority to the professionals using them. As progressive era politics ushered many women into the social sciences, the professions, and some federal agencies, women in new positions found charts helped authorize the feminized science of nutrition and health as an objective, legitimate pursuit. And the simplification of health that this use of numbers allowed for also meant that many lay women, especially mothers and teachers, could be brought into the project easily. As a result, organizations didn't just throw the charts into the back of their health pamphlets, they designed whole health programs around the charts. And I should say, I'm not trying to say that these government agents are maniacal and power hungry. Obviously, they genuinely believe in the statistics they're using, but I also don't think it was lost on them that there was a lot of authority to be had with the numbers. So, how did charts begin to restructure health nationwide? Well, the Cooperative Extension Service, especially through the youth group 4-H, provides an example of how one federal agency promoted health weight statistics with fervor in the 1910s and 20s. Cooperative Extension was an education-based federal agency that tried to spread specific scientific information through very localized branches. Information on farming, on rural living, and they did so with casual courses, home visits, and youth programs. And these health contests and 4-H held health contests to help encourage children and parents to start adopting height weight standards. Oops. And so health contests encouraged rural children to drink 6 glasses of water a day, eat fruits and vegetables, avoid candy, and also frequently encouraged public height weight measurements. 4-H members filled out health habit scorecards. Then contestants were measured, weighed, and inspected in a general fashion by physicians, maybe a little reminiscent of the Westminster Dog Show. So while the purpose was instructional, monetary prizes as well as cups and ribbons, like these men are sporting, were awarded to the boys and girls who were scored the numerically healthiest out of 100 points. Promotional materials explain that, quote, the 100% boy or girl will have steady growth, firm, well-developed muscles, average weight for height or above. The 4-H judges conflated height and weight, although they did include other factors, but they used measurement as their primary, most clear, most objective measurement. Ag Extension also began offering weight loss and gain courses in some counties, including Watchful weighing right here in Tompkins County, which encourage women to count calories and report their weight loss and gains in pounds as early as the 1920s. As with many early weight loss programs instituted by government agencies, the Agricultural Extension Service in this case saw, more health champions, crown and scepters in hand. I knew I missed something. All right, so as with many early weight loss programs, the Ag Extension Service in this case saw themselves responding to public desire rather than imposing a program on people. Based on just how many people would show up when they would have a class, they were always surprised. So the decision to increase the number of these weight loss programs was not based on any stated belief that residents were fat, but instead on just how many people came and how many people wanted the programs to come, how many people told their friends about their programs. Such courses both relied on standardized tables to determine who was of an appropriate or inappropriate weight, and also used quantified corrective measures to rectify the situation. The Children's Bureau, a woman-run agency designed to focus on, there's our class. Always one step behind on the pictures. But you can see, of course, that not only is she instructing these parents, but she's instructing them there's a normal weight and height curve, and that's a chart, probably Baldwin Wood. So the Children's Bureau was designed to focus on child health and well-being, and it also enthusiastically embraced the popularity of height-weight charts. And in its 1919 Children's Year campaign, which attempted to measure a huge swath of American children by sending materials to women's clubs, to nonprofit groups, to local agencies like Cooperative Extension, it attempted to make 1919 the year of the child. Not only did club women and reformers take up the challenge, they did so with an enthusiasm that allowed them to reach tens of thousands of children in 1919. The reported measurements allowed reformers to educate women in issues of child hygiene, again, and height weight, but even more importantly, they allowed the Children's Bureau to collect data and compile information on the weights of this extraordinary number of children. Given the number of children targeted and the makeshift nature of many of the child hygiene clinics, the Children's Bureau emphasized height and weight measurements as the most important indicator of child health. Along with age and location, Height and weight were the only data reported to the federal agency. And out of that data, the Children's Bureau began making its own charts so that it was actually printing competing charts. It both continued to print Baldwin Wood and Woodbury, but in other things, it would print its own information. This is an infant chart, so it should also be printing the Woodbury. So in a little bit of a preview out of all of this, though, of some of the trouble that was going to start to come with height weight charts, we see that after the Children's Bureau compiles all this information and puts it in their booklets, some people who had been involved in weighing write into the Children's Bureau and say, I'm not sure you should use those statistics. Not everybody was well enough trained who was measuring children, and we were doing it really quickly. We had a lot of children to measure. I don't know that they're accurate enough. And people from the Children's Bureau said, they're numbers, they're averages, we have a huge sample size, they're good enough. And so at both levels, I think we see the incredible faith that agents are putting in quantitative measurements, whether it's that they believe they should be perfect, or whether it's that they believe they're so objective they'll kind of sort themselves out. Now, those home economists that maybe you thought I'd never get to, in general, they're going to position themselves unusually amid this sea of height weight enthusiasm. Home economists frequently come out of backgrounds of scientific training, biology, chemistry, and while they're forced to do what Margaret Rossiter calls the women's work of science, even with those degrees, they nevertheless took their position as scientists very seriously, especially because other people didn't necessarily take that position seriously. Perhaps it seems like that made them even more intense about what they were going to accomplish and made them a little bit more skeptical about a simplified project like height weight charts. Instead, they concentrated extensively on vitamins, which were fairly recently named even by 1908, say, as well as specific elements of growth, like calcium. That was much more interesting to them, to imagine how calcium led to growth or to lack of growth than it was to think about the end product. So they're going to deal with that, with dietary patterns, and for people who are strict economists among them, they'll deal with food budgeting. They count calories as units of energy, not as units that are supposed to make you fatter or thinner. They're indirectly always going to be related to weight. The home economists know that, but they very rarely want to talk about it. There's a recent book that I partially agree with called Measured Meals, in which the author essentially blames home economists for taking all of the fun out of eating historically and turning it into a science project, replacing our natural instincts with these strict guidelines. And that isn't completely untrue, but I mean, the home economists also, they did so out of a scientific desire to get things as accurate as possible. So they also don't totally discount simplification, as you can see those not so recent 100-calorie portions that they're trying to use to make it simpler to make decisions about food. But that's a simplification, like food groups say, that's very different than accepting height weight charts. Take 1919, for example, as the Children's Bureau launched its nationwide Year of the Child, and as 4-Hers busily filled out health scorecards, home economists at all levels proved disinterested. The Journal of Home Economics that year provides a better sense of what was on their mind: the nutritional problems of Jewish dietary patterns, the problem of dietary specialists rather than physicians running malnutrition clinics, and changes in the food value of cooked versus uncooked vegetables. Nothing on height weight charts was going to make the cut. It's not that home economists were unconcerned with the citizen body. Really, they're as preoccupied as all of these other groups. But their obsession lay not in figuring out what bodies had come to look like, but rather in figuring out what should go in them in the first place. A nutrition study performed by home economists at the University of Illinois, for example, focused not on height weight. It doesn't appear to have even taken those measurements, but only on nutrition in the strictest sense, the calorie, protein, and fat intake of students under examination. In fact, the first meaningful reference to height weight in the critical journal of home economics appears to have come in 1920 when a reporter was talking about the New York State Health Conference in which all these other groups were there, the AMA, the Public Health Service. And in it, the author explains how height weight tables are inaccurate, and she recommends any assessment of this sort should include height weight along with age, fatness, posture, alertness or apathy, musculature, and body framework. This would be a start at a decent assessment. Federal level home economists, as a result of not highly valuing weight as a method of assessing health, also tried to stay out of the fray of weight loss issues. In one letter to a concerned citizen who had written in about who'd asked home economists to help her lose weight, the home economist explains that, quote, if one believes that his weight should be changed decidedly, advice should be sought from a competent physician, as any attempt to materially raise or lower body weight may be unpleasant. Home economists actively tried to distance themselves from popular weight loss books as well, since weight loss books at the time were actually using their calorie information, but not using it in the way that they wanted it to be used. So they also wrote a lot about how they didn't endorse things that it seemed like they endorsed because there was the Department of Ag logo on them. This they endorsed. So while home economists found their strict interpretation of nutrition standards at times it put them at odds with some of the people they were trying to reach, which I'll get to in a moment, within a few years the tables turned and the home ec position on weight standards became the norm for many working in all facets of public health. Even by the early 1920s, many of the same experts who had made height weight charts household names grew concerned over both the chart's research and its uses. Some even believed that their inappropriate use could actually impair citizen health. Statistical and medical researchers worried the tables were often based on overly small samples, didn't distinguish by region, locality, or ethnicity, and represented averages rather than ideals. The charts in circulation were inconsistent, and users queried the government about which one they were supposed to use. Other experts, like Charles Davenport, found the charts too standardizing and argued that rigid weight standards would promote uniformity among Americans, saying, "Let us be glad that we are ourselves and not try and drown our personalities in the sea of the average." One contingent of critics focused their concern on the scientific veracity of the charts. Different tables, for instance, used different guidelines for classifying subjects. The Woodbury and Baldwin Wood tables took age into consideration as they looked through children by the month in some cases. And a 12-year-old and 17-year-old of the same height should weigh different things. One ag extension chart provided different height weight expectations for Mexican Americans, African Americans, and whites. And in 1922, actually, the US military issued two charts for applicants, one for all except Filipinos and one for Filipinos who were serving because of the annexation, because of the invasion of the Philippines, were serving actually pretty extensively in the military. So, at least one Children's Bureau baby measuring contest also insisted that black and white babies be judged separately because their measurements, at least as part of the reason, the measurements were incommensurable. Most charts took sex or gender into account, but some developed totally separate male-female charts, and others said women should subtract 3 pounds or 5 pounds from whatever the male weight is. And some offered ranges, some gave one number, some said you should use body build, like large, medium, and some said that there should be 5 types, so very slender, slender, medium, fleshy, very fleshy. Others grouped all chart subjects into uniform categories. Most charts were designed around the fact that your clothes would weigh 5 pounds, which is of course not guaranteed, but they said add in 5 pounds. So prescribed healthy weights, in other words, varied according to which chart was employed, sometimes dramatically. The inconsistency of charts was again not simply an annoyance to public health workers, but in fact a serious problem. Lewis Dublin, the statistician with MetLife before, and John Gephardt, a social welfare director with the New York Association for Improvement of Conditions of the Poor, examined these problems in 1923. Both researchers, importantly, were originally responsible for spreading the idea that nutritional status could be measured by height-weight charts. But in their 1924 publication for the American Child Health Association, they both questioned whether height-weight charts were indeed meeting their objectives. They worried that the charts were used, basically that the charts were too general to be used on individual children instead of groups of children. And they gave exhaustive examinations to 3,000 children, Italian children, who were under the care of the New York Association for Improving the Condition of the Poor. And the examinations were focused on identifying undernourished children based on subjective means. So they brought a doctor in, and the doctor said, what's their musculature? What's the luster of their eyes? What's the color and bearing of the children? What's their posture? What's their relative amount of subcutaneous fat? And on the other hand, they also measured the children for height and weight using the Baldwin-Wood tables. These physical exams suggested that 34% of those children examined by a doctor were deemed undernourished, while height-weight charts only deemed 6% undernourished. And also, the height-weight charts only diagnosed around 6% of children as underweight. So the nutritional status of Americans, Dublin and Gephardt concluded, based on their own, perhaps equally arbitrary research, was not something that could be effectively judged by height and weight. The potential inaccuracy of the charts was rooted in tensions between these experts who wanted a standard versus non-standard physique, and others who argued that they must allow for bodily diversity. When Italian children were only compared to other Italian children, Dublin and Gephardt said, the statistics were a much better indicator of their actual health. The most popular charts, they said, did not include a wide enough range of heights, a very big problem for the, quote, very short children occurring among Italians. A physician aiding the data collection concluded that malnutrition exhibits itself less in this emaciated figure than in the muscles, in the subjective measures. So Dublin and Gephardt insisted that height and weight must be tied to ethnicity, not to a national standard. And they're really not alone in the findings they have at the time, even though they're not about ethnicity. In 1923, a team of statisticians published findings that 4% of the highest ranked children, when you look at them qualitatively, who are said, these children are excellent, were in fact underweight when you use charts, creating unnecessary worry, right? And in fact, on the other end, 40% of the children who were qualitatively understood to be in poor nutrition were within normal weight range. So they should have been worried and wouldn't be based on charts. As studies in this vein piled up, it became increasingly clear to professionals that height and weight charts were inadequate, if not downright dangerous, guideposts of health. In an attempt to sort through these conflicting regimes of measurement, many of the organizations participated in a committee convened by the American Child Health Association, essentially designed to standardize standards. Robert Woodbury, who designed the Woodbury Tables, argued that the only way to eliminate discrepancies was with statistical smoothing. It's a math problem. While Anna Rood from the Children's Bureau said the committee could probably agree on some child growth rates, but it couldn't ever claim that these were about nutrition. And following the meetings, basically, they came up with no solution, no agreement, but some of the organizations, like the Child's Health Association, decided that they were only going to publish the tables now as a direct contribution of the authors. They were no longer going to say they endorsed them, merely that they were publishing them. And so prominent physician Emmett Holt also says, only the authors, anyone can use the tables, but only the authors will be responsible for them. At the conclusion of these conferences and debates, American social scientists and health agencies agreed they could not agree on anthropometric measurements of nutritional status. Through the mid-1920s and into the early 30s, experts in health and nutrition from government agencies and the private sector vocally expressed their dissatisfaction with height-weight charts, albeit in conflicting ways. Some wanted standardization, others wanted more research, others wanted them completely out of circulation. So Baldwin of Baldwin Wood said in particular, the problem with the charts is that they could be grossly abused in, quote, the hands of novices. And yet as expert voices pulled back and modified these charts, many of the so-called novices did not respond to expert opinion as expected. I argue in the extended piece that even though many statisticians, physicians, and agencies came to question and even reject charts so soon after the creation, the charts made the substantial impression on novices who weren't willing to let them go. But today, basically, I want to zero in specifically on what happens with home economists at the time, as I wind down, I promise. And it's just at this very moment when agencies try and downplay charts that many home economists become more receptive to them. In the aftermath of the chart debates, as one would expect, the Journal of Home Economics argued that doctors in this country consider it unwise to use hard and fast signs of health in childhood. But then the author continued, explaining that many professionals and volunteers have a very real need for some safe, workable signs of health. The author wanted you to pay attention to more than just height, weight, looking at the clearness of the eyes and the look of the teeth, but also admitted that while height weight charts had so frequently been considered the all-important tool, they could be used as long as they were used with other things. It's a small concession, but it's still a notable concession as we move forward. An article in the Cornell Homemakers Bulletin, written by home economist Hazel Houck, more clearly illustrates the awkward line walked by home economists who knew their audiences wanted numbers at this point, that lay audiences trusted numbers and also wanted the authority to use them. And yet they also were uncomfortable with overemphasizing them. So after Houck actually presents strict charts with a single number range, which is a very strict chart, she also goes on to explain that you can actually be above or below that and you're probably fine, but what you should really do is get your height weight, look at the number, see where you fall, and then go get a mirror and look at yourself in the mirror and ask yourself, quote, can I count my ribs? Are my collarbones or my hip bones too prominent? Do my shoulder blades suggest sprouting wings? Only then does Houck suggest that the reader might truly be underweight. The same applies for the overweight. Sure, there are charts and numbers on the previous 2 pages, but Houck concludes that readers should, quote, look for bulges and telltale rolls of fat. The continued discomfort of home economists like Houck with the charts that they nevertheless continued to promote shows not only in the advice itself, but all the way down to the mixed tools of measurement recommended, in this case, the juxtaposition of your mirror, this very subjective tool, with your charts, your scale and your ruler. But home economists were met with public demand for the wider dissemination of height-weight charts, as well as for specific information on weight gain and loss over and over and over. So the Federal Home Economics Bureau received so many requests on fad diets and how to lose 30 pounds in 30 days, very sincerely, that essentially they start off by responding like we would expect. Have you checked your vitamins? Are you eating from all the food groups? But then basically, by 1931, they're going to have so many responses that they start writing form letters to deal with the issue. And one of them says, care should be taken to supply enough minerals, vitamins, efficient protein in bulk to keep the body in good health while limiting calories. And another says, go talk to a physician. Basically, the Bureau doesn't want to touch these, but as an organization exceptionally close to its audience, I think that's key in kind of understanding why they're different, especially middle-class women who care deeply about the advice home economists offered. There was no ignoring the issue entirely. Form letters and referrals to medical authorities didn't cap the flow of inquiries. Professional home economists' general rejection of standards then transformed into a tentative acceptance of them at the behest of constituencies. By the early 1930s, the Home Economics Bureau attempted to address the issue in a pamphlet called Consider Your Weight, Fatter, Thinner, or As Is. The 1933 version of the pamphlet didn't include a height-weight chart or any specifically quantitative discussion at the size one shouldn't diet, but it does say that if you weigh decidedly more or less than the average weight, it's up to you to either decide what to do or to prove that you're in your best health as is. Compared to the charts of the AMA and the specific over and underweight percentiles used by social workers or physicians, the vague discussion speaks to some of their reluctance. But it's important to see then that by the next year, they issue a second pamphlet in 34, and just a year later, they've already started becoming more comfortable with some stricter guidelines and a much harder line for those who fall outside of bodily norms. They still don't include a chart, but they emphasize measuring much more, assuming other people have access to the myriad charts out there. And they start saying things like that there are, this is a quote, there are, boundary lines above or which we should not go if our weight's to be desirable. And weight isn't just a matter of personal vanity. It's an indication of how things are going on inside of us. And despite swarms of disagreeing experts, even within the Bureau, they were willing to accept these quantitative methods, essentially accept the idea that numbers of height and weight were now indications of health to some extent, in a really surprisingly quick turnabout. Indeed, this acceptance occurred a bit quicker at the professional rather than federal level, if you can make that distinction. So Cornell home economists Flora Rose and Mary Henry wrote an amazingly numbers-focused few chapters of weight advice for an American Medical Association book in 26. It emphasized weight as a starting point for all investigations into health. Like most contemporary work of home economists, especially those working from within the Bureau, Rose and Henry absolutely focused on nutrition. It wasn't something they gave up. They were interested in milk consumption and vitamins and food groups, and it was all over the chapters they wrote. But they also were far more comfortable with weight than some that came before them. And they wrote, for the most part, that attempts at weight control are the result of an earnest desire to improve health. They included charts. They actually included the 1915 life insurance chart. And they focused extensively on the quality of bodily mass versus the amount of bodily mass as a way of working through the charts. Eventually, height-weight tables regained popularity on a large scale in some of the civilian groups that essentially had been so wary of them. So Thomas Wood himself of the Baldwin Wood tables, even though he got over the Baldwin Wood tables, he then produced all these new updated statistics by the mid-20s. The Metropolitan Life Insurance, which had come out with those original statistics with Lewis Dublin. Lewis Dublin denounces them. He was the one looking at all the Italian children. But in 42 for men and 43 for women, he produces what essentially are the most famous height-weight charts for MetLife. And they're going to be used over and over, published in publications of the USDA, because at that point, a lot of these government agencies were no longer willing to make their own charts, but they were willing to accept the insurance company charts. So home economists didn't abandon their dedication to scientific veracity, despite their compromised position, but they were challenged to stay relevant, which means helpful, useful, and practical by both constituents and eventually professional home economists outside of government. And they did that, ultimately, by following rather than leading the interests of so many women in measuring height and weight. The legacy of these decisions lives on today. Height-weight charts were used extensively throughout the 20th century and are still used for young children. And for the rest of us, we still see a modified version with the BMI, or the body mass index, the simplification of health, down to one number, which is even better. And in fact, the BMI is a term coined by Ansel Keys right here at Cornell, although he never, ever would have meant for it to be used the way we use it. But while accepting these measurements, which were instituted by the National Institute of Health as our federal guidelines in 1985, as quick indications, accepting it seems pretty natural, actually. I think we're very used to the idea of height weight being how a way we should measure ourselves. It's so natural, but it's nice, I think, to denaturalize a little bit, to think about how it developed, why it developed, and who developed it. The fights over how we keep the standards alive. It just gives us a little bit of room to think about how we use quantification today when we talk about health. And that essentially our use of the numbers today owes to those all-knowing progressives, but also to some reluctant but receptive home economists. Thank you.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.